Hi guys, this is Weasel for PokerBrainiacs.com, and we are going to be discussing the topic of slow playing. What is a slow play? It's when you take a passive line with a strong hand hoping to get paid on a later street. So you have a strong hand and instead of betting you decide to maybe check, or instead of raising you decide to maybe flat call, in the hopes that more of the money will go in on a later street. And there are two main reasons why this might happen. Either villain bets into you, and this can be as a bluff or for value. So perhaps you check back your strong made hand in position, villain decides you are weak and decides to fire two streets as a bluff perhaps. Or perhaps villain has a value hand, one that's slightly worse than yours, and villain assumes that he can bet for value since you've taken a passive line, and that his value hand is likely going to be good, when in actual fact it isn't because you have slow played. And the other way you can get paid off is simply because villain is going to call a big bet on a later street, partly because of the fact that you've underrepresented your hand. So maybe typically you wouldn't normally get, say, value on the turn and river with a certain hand, but because you check the flop and villain may expect you to bet certain hands on the flop, for example, and because he takes these strong hands out of your range, he then might be more likely to pay you off on a later street because he assumes your range of hands is weaker. So slow playing is a deceptive line, and it can be effective at getting villain to commit more chips to the pot in a situation where perhaps he otherwise wouldn't. The problem is a lot of players overuse slow playing, and when they do use it, they use it in a poor situation. A lot of players have the tendency perhaps to, every time they make a strong hand, their first instinct is to slow play that hand. In actual fact, there are relatively few situations where you want to be slow playing in general. Most of the time when you do flop a strong hand, you want to be betting for value, and if villain bets into you, you want to be raising to protect yourself against the draws. So there are very specific situations where you decide that you want to slow play. So when should you slow play? Usually you are going to need a very strong hand, but not always, as we will go on to discuss. And by very strong hand, I typically mean something which is going to be the nuts a huge amount of the time. For example, if you have quads, it's very unlikely villain has you beat, and if villain does have you beat, then you don't really need to worry about that. Perhaps something like the nut flush, or perhaps even top set on a dry board. And notice I say dry board because if you have top set on a board with a lot of draws, then it's not going to be a good situation to slow play. Now the key factor here is relative hand strength. You don't necessarily need to have top set. You could in fact have a hand like Ace King offsuit on an Ace 5-2 rainbow board, and that could still be a good spot to slow play because there are relatively few hands that villain can have, or relatively few hands also that you are worried about villain catching up to you with. If villain has a hand like pocket eights on this board, then he only has 2 outs. There aren't many draws he can have, and again if he has a worse ace, there aren't really many outs villain can have. So the key factor is relative strength. In general, you are not going to be slow playing one pair hands, you are going to be slow playing things like sets or full houses or quads, but in certain situations where your one pair hand is relatively very strong, depending on the flop texture and depending on other factors, you can end up slow playing one pair hands when these effectively constitute the nuts. As briefly touched on, you don't want to be slow playing if there are big draws available. For example, it might be okay to slow play the Ace King on the Ace 5-2 rainbow, and then you might assume that if it's okay to slow play Ace King in this spot, then you can slow play top set on, perhaps you have pocket queens and the flop is Queen Jack 9. this is not a spot you want to be slow playing in, because there are just going to be so many straight draws out there. There are also going to be perhaps flush draws some of the time. In general, if there is a good chance villain can have equity against your hand, if there are a lot of draws available, it is not going to be a good situation to slow play. And this is not just because villain has a chance of sucking out. It's also because if certain turn and river cards come, for example, let's say we have the pocket queens on the queen jack 9 as said, and hero decides to slow play, and the turn ends up being a 10, putting a 4 to the straight on the board. Even if villain hasn't made a straight with the 4 to straight board on, if villain does have a hand like 2 pair, he's going to be a lot more wary about paying you off, whereas if you had not slow played your hand, or hero had not slow played and had played aggressively on the flop, then he may have in fact got value from villain's worst hand if villain had 2 pair. So it's not just a case of whether villain's going to suck out, it's also a case of if certain scare cards come on later streets, you can also miss an opportunity for value. Not to mention in the case of draws, if villain has a flush draw on the turn, for example, hero can potentially get the rest of villain's stack if villain is the type of player that wants to put all his money in with a flush draw. But once villain has missed his flush draw, there is zero chance of hero getting any of villain's money on the river, because villain will just have a busted draw. Another reason we should slow play is dependent on villain's range. If villain's range is weak, we can consider slow playing more often. If villain does have a strong hand, if it's likely villain has 2 pair or maybe a set himself, depending on certain reads you have, then there's really no need to slow play. In fact, by slow playing, you are pretty much just risking losing value, because if you don't bet the flop, then it may be the case that you need to make big overbets on the turn and river in order to get the money in, and it may just be the case that villain is not going to be paying off big overbets. So in order to get the stacks in without having to make overbets, sometimes you are going to need to bet on all 3 streets. So by not betting when it's likely villain will call, you are just missing value. Also, it's a case that if some of the draws available might make villain a second nut hand, then it can be worth slow playing. And obviously you need to beat that second nut hand. So for example, perhaps you flop full house on a board with plenty of straight and flush draws out there, and you know that it's very likely villain perhaps has one of these draws, just given the flop texture. And you also know that it's likely that if villain does hit his straight draw or his flush draw, that he's going to put a lot more money in the pot. Whereas if you play too aggressively before villain has hit his hand, it's likely he is just going to fold. And these often become good spots to slow play, because you actually want villain to make his strong made hand, his flush or his straight, because unbeknownst to villain, he is in fact drawing dead anyway when he makes his hand, or at least drawing extremely thin. So again, it's a good spot to slow play when you have a very strong hand that can't be cracked by any of villain's draws, something like quads or a top full house. But who should you slow play against? One good target is an aggressive player who will fire multiple streets. And although we typically think of slow playing as being hero perhaps checking back in position, so perhaps on the flop after hero's open raised and hero's in position, hero flops a strong hand and then decides not to c-bet. This is the traditional way of slow playing that automatically comes to people's mind, but if you take a much broader view of slow playing, it pretty much involves anything that isn't fast playing. So if you take a passive line such as flat calling instead of raising, by some definitions of the word you are in fact slow playing. So if you are facing an aggressive opponent and you know that this opponent is perhaps capable of even firing multiple barrels on a bluff, especially if he thinks your range is weak, then sometimes it can be a good opportunity to just call down because by raising your opponent on any given street, you may alert him to the fact that you have a strong hand. So this in itself is a form of slow playing. But also perhaps you even take the more traditional line of slow playing, where you maybe check back in position when you are the original open raiser. If villain is the kind that is going to be putting you on a range of hands, he then may proceed to perhaps fire 2 streets as a bluff. Basically, anytime you are facing an aggressive opponent who will take stabs at the pot and who will bet aggressively and thinly for value also, you quite possibly have a good opponent to slow play against. Whereas if someone is very passive, there may not be as much benefit to slow playing, because it's not as if they are going to bluff you just because they perceive your range to be weak. You will find that your slow plays are more effective against good hand readers who will adjust their perception of your range. So perhaps you make that deceptive play on the flop of checking back in position when they'd expect you to be c-betting with some of your value hands. If that player is a good hand reader, he may decide your range is weak, and then he may fire multiple barrels, or he may call you down light. Whereas if villain is completely unaware of what you are representing by certain players on certain streets, then it's not really going to matter that he should think your range is weak when he's just not thinking about your range at all. So in general, slow plays work a lot better against players who are perhaps slightly better than average, and or at least thinking about your range, and therefore can deduce your range is light in certain spots. There's a lot less value in slow playing players that are calling stations. There's possibly going to be a lot less value slow playing against passive players in general. But if these calling station type players are willing to call with their very marginal hand or very marginal draw on an earlier street, then there really is no reason to slow play. In fact, you are just going to be losing value by slow playing instead of betting. And also, these players may not be the type that are going to try and bluff you if you represent weakness by slow playing. So in general, if someone's going to be calling a lot with a worse hand, then it's not a good spot to slow play. You should just be betting for value. Also, on a similar line of thought, there's less value slow playing against players who will get all in with a weak draw, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about a flush draw on the turn. The only way to get value from these players, assuming that your strong hand doesn't beat their completed draw if they hit, the only way to get value from these players is to bet while their draw is still live. Once you reach the river and they've missed their draws, then you are not going to get any further value. So against certain players, if you suspect that there are some draws in their range, and you also know that these are the type of players who will happily get all in with their draws, even weak draws perhaps, then it's always going to be more beneficial for you to play the hand in an aggressive manner. So fast play some of your value hands if you think villain is not folding his marginal draw. Some players, however, might be the type who are going to fold their weaker draws to players like check raisers, in which case it may be a better option to again take a more passive line in this case. So slow playing does depend on ranges and board texture, but it also depends on the type of villain you are playing against. Some targets will be good targets to slow play, whereas in the same situation other players will not be good targets to slow play. So we are going to consider a few quick examples of situations that are either good to slow play or bad to slow play. Hero has ace-4 of diamonds on the button, and in this case Hero makes an open min raise from the button, the reason being the big blind is quite active and 3-betting quite actively. The flop comes ace-ace-5. The player in the big blind decides to check to Hero, and this is definitely a spot that Hero can think about slow playing. Hero could decide to bet for value, but a lot of the hands that are calling are either a hand like maybe pocket 8s or pocket 10s, hands that are going to have a difficult time calling multiple streets. In fact, a hand like pocket 8s, while it may check call this flop, is possibly going to be check folding the turn, and at the very least is going to be check folding the river, especially if hands like a king X or a queen comes on the turn or river over cards to his pocket pair. Perhaps he sometimes has a hand like 5x, and then a small proportion of the time villain is going to have an ace, and or maybe even something like pocket 5s, and pretty much any of villain's aces are probably going to beat hero's ace 4, so hero is going to be outkicked. So it seems like possibly a good spot to maybe check back and hope that perhaps villain can represent hands on a later street, or perhaps villain picks up a pair. Perhaps villain has something like king queen, and if hero checks back here, villain can maybe hit one of his pairs and will then perhaps pay off 2 streets, because hopefully by checking back it looks to some extent that hero doesn't have an ace. And the turn comes 9 of clubs, so it does put some possible draws out there. Hero could definitely consider raising here. However, it's also an okay spot to continue slow playing. It is possible that villain is bluffing here, and if villain's bluffing, it's going to be a good idea to let him fire the river as well, if villain just has some random hand. Also, by raising, hero may even fold villain off some of his draws, and at the moment, hero pretty much is going to have the best hand a huge amount of the time still, and hopefully it's going to be quite easy to get away from the hand if it does look like villain has made a strong draw on the river. But by checking back, hero is giving villain the opportunity to fight again on the river as a bluff, and also perhaps to make a pair still and pay off a river bet. So the hero checks back, and the river comes an ace, giving hero quads. And it's very likely now that if villain does have some type of pair, that he is not going to be folding, because it doesn't look like hero has an ace the way that hero has played the hand. And if villain has any pair of 9s, pair of 5s, or some kind of pocket pair, a lot of the time he is just going to think he has the best hand. And in this case, villain just shoves all in, which I'm not convinced is the best play, but it's a pretty easy decision for hero, and in this particular case, the slow play worked out. Okay, let's have a brief look at another example. And hero flats, I'm not going to go into that too much now. And we can see here that hero just flops the super nuts, and if hero had a slightly weaker hand, he might consider donking out for protection, but in this case hero decides that he is going to take a more passive line and check call down. The reason being, if villain does, or either villain makes any of their draws here, if they make a gut shot to Broadway for the ace to 10 straight, or they have any kind of club draw, it's possible that they are going to be putting money in on the later street, whereas if hero raises directly now, he is possibly going to be folding villain off their draws. So it's a good spot to slow play just because villain has such ridiculous reverse implied odds in this spot. Okay, let's look at an example of where not to slow play. Hero is on the button with queen 10. Hero open raises, both blinds call, and hero flops the nut straight. And this may seem to some people like a good spot to slow play just because hero's hand is so strong, but there are so many different draws out there. There are flush draws, if someone may even have trips to make a boat, there are straight draws. There's all kinds of draws out there that it really wouldn't ever make sense for hero to consider slow playing in this spot, especially against 2 players. The chances are that one of them has maybe a hand like 10 king with live straight outs or something similar is just too high, and there really is no point in ever slow playing on this board. And finally, another situation. Hero open raises the pocket kings from middle position, and this player on the button decides to 3-bet, and Hero decides to flat, which we won't go into too much at this stage. The flop comes King Queen 9. Again, yes, Hero has flopped top set, but it is not a good spot to slow play. There are so many draws and 2-pair combos of hands that villain can have. In this case, Hero just decides to check shove because it seems likely that villain is not going to be folding anything that has hit that flop. And villain calls and he turns over ace king. And again, on this particular flop texture, it's also the case, not are we only worried about villain having a hand with equity, but we're also worried about certain scare cards coming off. For example, suppose Hero had decided to slow play on this board and just check call, and the turn comes his queen. It's going to be that much more difficult now for Hero to get all the money in, because villain sitting there with ace king is going to be thinking, I wonder if Hero has hit that queen. So it's not only just the chance of villain sucking out, but it's also the chance of certain scare cards coming on a later street, which can cause Hero to lose value. So I hope that's been a useful introduction to the topic of slow playing. This has been Weasel for PokerBrainiacs.com. Thanks for watching.